Calling Papa Home. By 1871, the year of the Great Fire, nearly all business in Peshtigo, Wisconsin came from lumbering. Men made buckets, tubs, broom handles, and clothespins in the wooden ware factory. Other factories in Peshtigo built doors and window frames. Outside Peshtigo, much of the land was still forest. Logging and railroad companies cleared land for track and timber. They left behind a terrible mess of stumps, rotting logs, piles of branches, and brush. Prairie grass grew in some places, and invitation for fire. Fires had always burned in the big forests. The fires were usually quick and small, and they actually cleaned up the forest floor. When forests were cut for logging or railroads, fires still started, but they weren't short and quick because the ground was covered with branches and rotting logs and burned long and hot. Now, fire was a terrible, terrible danger. In 1871, almost no rain fell. Everyone feared fire. All it would take would be one spark from a railroad engine, one careless farmer burning stumps, one flash of lightning. There were many fires across the state that year, but the biggest fire happened on October 8th. By the end of the fire, 2,400 square miles of land, or 1.5 million acres, had burned. About 1,400 people died. It was called the Great Peshtigo Fire. Calling Papa Home. Nobody really knows what started the fire. For weeks before, Papa would stop and sniff. He'd mutter, "Fire out in the sugar bush," or "Some fools burning stumps west of town." The sugar bush, a grove of sugar maple trees where maple sap is harvested to make maple syrup. Every day, the smell of smoke hung in the air. Mama's clean wash turned gray on the clothesline. My sister Lydia, and she couldn't breathe. Sometimes from the window of our little house on the hill, I could see a glow far to the west. Fires were burning. Papa knew about forests and fire. He'd been a lumberman since he was 14. He cut white pine on the Wolf River. He had worked 15 years for Mr. Red, logging and riding logs down the Chippewa. I bet he was a river driver. Papa's name is Johnny, John Regis McDonald. Mama's name is Lizette. Papa met Mama at a dance in Eau Claire. He says he checked out the dance floor like a cruiser walking the forest, looking for a best white pine. He spied Mama across the room, and that was that. Your Mama took my heart right then and there. I asked her to dance and won myself the prettiest girl in Wisconsin. Papa was a river pig. He and the other men rode pine logs to the sawmills for Mr. Red and his partner, Mr. Ole. Mr. Red had red hair, just like me. Papa says Red taught him everything there was to know about lumbering. So when Papa looked into the sky and said, "Too dry, fire's bound to catch hold," I worried. When Papa said the whole state was dry as leaves in November, I worried more. When folks in Peshtigo spread sawdust on the streets to keep down the dust, Papa said they were fools. He said sawdust would catch fire in the blink of an eye. Fires happened all the time. Sometimes hunters were careless with campfires out in the woods. Sometimes farmers burned stumps to clear their land. One Saturday in September, fire blew in from the west. I saw giant flaming balls jump from treetop to treetop. Birds screamed in the sky. In town, men walked the streets armed with shovels and wet burlap sacks. Everybody prayed for rain. The town was saved when the wind changed and the fire burned itself out. Papa said someday the wind wouldn't change. He said one day the whole country could burn to the ground. I believed him. After the fire, everybody believed him. At least everybody who was still alive. So I think this little girl is remembering back. She's setting the stage for our story. And all of these events have happened already. And she is now going to be thinking back or a flashback to what happened in the story. Hence that little divider mark in the page to help us know different scene, different setting, different time. Mama married Papa when he worked on the river. The first baby was born. That's me, Susanna. Papa took one look at my red hair and called me Little Red. He always said, "Well, call her Susanna when she's grown." Lydia was next. She was named after Mama's sister. Nels was the baby named after Papa's best friend back in the pinery. When Nels was born, Mama and Papa decided river work was too dangerous. Papa found a job at Mr. Ogden's woodenware factory in Peshtigo. I guess Papa knew how to keep people moving, just like he moved the logs to the sawmill, because right off, Mr. Ogden made him foreman, or the leader. With the foreman's job came a foreman's pay. Now, we weren't rich like Mr. McCartney in the mill owner in the big white house on the hill. But Papa's pay was enough to buy the old schoolhouse and build a whole room for Mama and him and a loft for Lydia, Nels, and me. He bought a black and silver stove for Mama. The best thing about living in the old schoolhouse was the bell. Mr. McCartney had bought a fancy brass bell for the new Union School, but nobody thought to take down the bell at the old school. When Papa bought the building, the town threw the bell in for free, like a runt pig sold with its mama. So every morning, Papa walked to town, down the hill into the sunrise. He kept men and lumber moving all day. At night, when the sun was setting over the sugar bush, he'd walk home again. He crossed the river with the big bridge at Front Street and made his way up the hill. He was home in time for supper. In summer, I'd see him coming up the hill. In winter, darkness covered Peshtigo like a blanket long before Papa came home. I'd rush home from school and wait until the hands of the wind-up clock stood straight up and down. 6 o'clock. Then I'd run out and ring the bell. Of course, I didn't pull the bell rope. Papa said ringing the bell would bother Mr. McCartney in his big white house. He cut the rope and taken it out the ringer when we moved in. But if I tossed stones at it, the bell would ring softly. With every ring, it was like I was calling Papa home. Papa missed being a lumberjack and working on the river. But Red and Ole and his old crew of lumberjacks had followed the White Pine west. Papa said Peshtigo was a good home for us. As long as America keeps buying Mr. Ogden's barrels and broom handles, we'll live here, he said. Mama said, as long as we have each other, we'll live happy. And we did, until the fire. And that is where we're going to stop today.